Well, hi there, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, people all over the place. I'm John Mancini, and welcome to this episode of the OxyMorons. And Laurie and Kurt, welcome. Nice to have you here.
Thanks, John.
John?
The origin of the show, for folks that don't know it, is that we all have spent an awful lot of time over the years talking about how successful implementations and projects are 85% people and 10% process and 5% technology. And then we all proceed to act in exactly the opposite way. And we put all those beautiful charts up about technology stacks. And I've become convinced over the years that the people that are really successful are the ones that put the people side of the equation first and foremost. And specifically, these people that I call oxymorons. And you can think of them as visionary pragmatists or practical dreamers or whatever kind of a term, but it's that combination of dreaming and pragmatism that I find really interesting in people, mainly because I don't have both capabilities. And so I'm very jealous of people that do. So the reason for these guys, I thought we'd talk about generational leadership today. And Laurie and Kurt, I saw a really intriguing presentation that you all did at the MER conference, which triggered the idea that it might be fun to talk about some of these ideas through a generational lens. And so welcome. And I thought we'd just quickly start. Tell folks who you are, just so they have some idea. I don't like formal bios, but Laurie, why don't you go first and just give people a sense of who you are?
Sure, thanks, John. So Laurie Fischer, and I'm the Managing Director at HBR Consulting's Information Governance service line, and we do all things information governance, from establishing what that means in the first place through implementation and hopefully successful change management.
Great. Kurt, how are you?
Hey there. My name's Kurt Neumann. I am a records and information principal at Prime Therapeutics. I've been there for about 7 years. And I basically lead up the information governance arm of our company. Many years ago, about 5 years ago, information governance really wasn't talked about at Prime. And so over the years, we've been trying to introduce those concepts. And where we are now with various implementations, as Laurie was saying, we are in a place where we're actually pulling the various leaders together, and we're trying to start out new with Information Governance Council, things like that. So it's definitely a new world out there, and it's a pleasure to be here to talk with you about the various generational observations that Laurie and I have made that we really feel are so important to those implementations and the technologies you were saying, John.
Terrific. Great to have you guys here. And so let me start off with a little bit of a softball question, just to get people a sense of who you are. Either a favorite book or a surprising thing on your playlist, or favorite binge TV show, something to just give a little insight behind the curtain, if you will. So Kurt, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thanks, John. So I would have to pick favorite book. My favorite book in the last year has been, it's called Open by Johan Norberg. He's an economist from Scandinavia, and he talks about the concept of openness and closedness, not in the sense of open-mindedness and closed-mindedness. It's like that, but he talks about it in how society views change. And if you're open to change and if you're closed to change, and what he actually points out is that in each and every one of us, no matter how open-minded or closed-minded you think you are to change, you have both qualities inside of you. And somehow if you feel you're more closed-minded by default, there have been experiences in your life, and I think that bring you to that point of defaulting to that, whereas openness has the same type of qualities, but we all struggle or challenge ourselves, if you will, with that. So I love that book because I think it dives directly into how innovation happens and how we think about change, because as you're pointing out, it's people-based. So that's why I really like this new book called Open.
Cool. Interesting. So I'll have to post a link to that. Laurie, how about you?
Wow, well, so Kurt, you're way more cerebral than I have been during so I'll give you a twofer. And I was never much of a binge TV watcher, but COVID changed that. And I will say somebody turned me on to Billions, and I think I binge watched it over a weekend and was like, amazed. But as far as a book, here's one that's kind of interesting. Not necessarily my favorite book, but one that I was compelled to go back and read because I had read it years ago at university during my existential philosophy studies, and that was The Plague by Albert Camus.
Oh.
And it documents what happens in North Africa during a bubonic plague episode. And, you know, boy, that was quite amazing read to go back to that again and kind of compare it to what we've been going through for the past few months.
For sure. Yeah, no, it's interesting. One thing that I find fascinating are when you read, I almost always like books better than I like the movie version of the book. And so, not to mention with The Plague, the real life version of the book, but the in that category, I recently read the book The Undoing, which became an HBO series. And what always intrigues me is when the movie goes totally off the rails in terms of not following the book. And I always think, wow, I wonder how the author feels to have their work basically. I mean, both were great. Both are really suspenseful, interesting things, but very, very different book from movie. So anyway, so we'll move on from there. And if anybody else has the other one, which always strikes me as one, is that we love the movie Field of Dreams, and that book is not nearly as good as the movie. The movie is way better than the book. So that was an unusual case in which it kind of flipped the other way around. So let's hop in and talk a little bit about generational cohorts. And I believe there are 5. And on each of the questions I want to ask you, we don't necessarily have to, have a 4-question by 5 cohort matrix and fill in every box, because we can kind of cover some of it. But let's just start out with what the cohorts are, just so everybody knows what we're talking about. So who wants to start?
Well, we can go back and forth. So the group that, and we're concerned with, how we interact and interface with them in the workplace. So and I don't want to be accused of age discrimination, but the oldest group in there is what we would call the traditionalists. And this is the greatest generation. These are the, World War II folks, and very shaped. And by the way, right now, the smallest percentage in the workforce, only 9% are still in the workforce. So, Kurt, you want to talk about the boomers?
Sure. So baby boomers probably get the most street cred out there because they're what they call the me generation. They kind of started this. 1945 to 1964. They largest generation in the workforce up until very recently. And they're continuing to work in the workforce. And so it's very interesting to see how why they have continued to stay in. They very, very much view generational or organizational structure as being very important to understanding more like chain of command way of thinking. We'll talk about how that differs later with other generations, but that's kind of your foray into boomer. Did I get that right, Laurie?
Yep, pretty much so. Not quite as a chain of command as the traditionalist, but still there.
It's still there.
Yeah. Then we have the Gen X. And Gen X is an interesting generation. 65 to 1980 is about the time period. And along with the baby boomers are like 29% of the workforce. Gen X and millennials are, I think, Kurt, around 35% each.
Yeah.
Gen X is an interesting generation. This was what we called the first generation of latchkey kids. Both parents tend to be working. There was a pretty high divorce rate, and it really shaped their view of independence and how they approach things. They love independence. They don't want to be, tied down to things, and really an interesting kind of reaction to COVID as well, being one of the generations that has done the best in the work from home environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, after that are the famous millennials, right? The one we always like to paint that broad brush about.
Yeah. So they're the largest generation in existence right now. And so it kind of follows in the heels of the boomers, if you will, because you're going to start to see a skip generation is what you're going to start to see in some of the descriptions. But millennials love to collaborate. They like, they believe, or we believe, that more heads are better than one. So this whole independence piece is tempered like a piece of steel with more ideas. And so they talked about, there's another session at the conference we were just at, John, that talked about cognitive flexibility. And that's the idea that you can consider more than one idea at the same time. It's different than multitasking, which boomers tend to do a little bit more generationally. But I see cognitive flexibility as being something that the millennials bring forward as something new to the mix.
And then you got the Gen Z. And Gen Z, I've got to cheat and look at 2001 to about 2020. So these are kind of the newest folks coming into the workforce, estimated at about 5% of the workforce right now. But, you know, born digital. Do you guys remember that video that went viral showing the 2-year-old little girl, and she had an iPad, and she was very calm and very pleased, and she's just kind of scrolling through page after page. They take away the iPad and they put a stack of magazines in front of the little girl. And she tries doing the same thing, and she can't get the page to turn, and she starts screaming and yelling, and the poor little thing has no idea how to open a book or a magazine. So they give her back the iPad, and she's happy once again. So these are, you know, fear of missing out. They don't want to miss out. It's crowdsourcing at its best. They are going to become some of the most savvy consumers, along with the Gen Alpha who come after them, because again, they were born with this technology. It is absolutely second nature to them. And how we think about change management with them as a generation, as well as the other generations, is going to be very impacted by their zeitgeist as being Zs.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I remember watching my granddaughter, who's 7 years old, and I watch her. The two things. One is that I remember when she was very little, same deal. You know, if a TV was accessible to her, she would kind of go up to it and try to swipe it, and I just thought that was really interesting. And then she was in second grade this year, and watching her do remote learning with her little headset on, it looked like. Really date myself now. It looked like one of those call operators on those Time magazine commercials where they used, you know, operators are available. She had like everything kind of up, and, you know, knew exactly how to navigate everything. And I thought, wow, this person's going to be really scary coming into the workplace for some folks later on. So talk a little bit about what makes a good leader in some of these groups. And as I say, we don't have to necessarily go through all 5, although we can. But you know, pick one and talk about what a good leader looks like.
Well, I'll just start with a more general approach, and then I'll let Kurt dig into the weeds a little bit. But you know, we've all been to many seminars and sessions on leadership, and we know those, you know, 5 to 10 qualities that everybody picks out. You know, empathy and intelligence and emotional intelligence, you know, it goes on and on. So all of those are important, regardless of the generation that you're in. But one of the things that Kurt and I have found through the research is that an organization really is better if they have a diverse workforce. We hear a lot about D&I right now, diversity and inclusion, given what's been going on in this country in the past year. But often those conversations don't talk about the diversity of the generations. And that absolutely needs to be considered as a leader, knowing that how you're going to communicate, how you listen to people, you know, those nonverbal signals, all of those things are incredibly important in order to get your way. And that's what a leader is. A leader wants to get his or her way. They're leading towards a solution, and understanding those generational differences and how you communicate and the message you deliver is going to be really important, in addition to some of the other D&I considerations. Lots of studies. I think McKinsey was one of the stronger ones that show the economic impact in a positive manner to the bottom line of a diverse workforce, and getting that diverse workforce to be accepted and take the leadership that is given to them. So, Kurt, you want to talk about some more specifics?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm going to jump around a little bit, John, because some things come to mind more so than others. So with the Generation X, I'd say what makes a good leader is actually having, you know, not just a concept of, as Laurie talked about, sense of independence for oneself, but enabling They're people that report to them, or just if you're an indirect leader, right, of people, which oftentimes in the information management governance world, we end up being indirect leaders, giving others the independence to do what they need to do. And so I think that's what makes a good leader with Generation X. With millennials, it's really that focus on the soft skills. And this is where it brings back to what you mentioned about the people side of the equation. We're forgetting, we've forgotten, hey, we're going to stand up this technology. Well, it didn't check all the boxes. It wasn't the cure-all, right? Well, the millennials here are focusing so much on soft skills because collaboration and cooperation are so important to the generation. So I think what makes a good millennial leader is focusing on those soft skills. Laurie, do you want to talk real quick maybe about the boomers? How it makes a good leader with a boomer, and then we can jump to the last generation, Z.
Yeah, I mean, the boomers are very process driven and process oriented. They want to see, they're very results oriented. I think kind of pulling back from that a little bit and understanding how the other generations react to that, to Kurt's point, and we haven't mentioned those two words yet, but I'm going to say them now before we get much further, because it is what all this is about, and it's change management. When we talk about people, process, technology, John, right? There's everything we do as IG professionals results in some change to one of those. Either it's new technology, and that's not the solution; it's the enabler to the solution, or it's roles and responsibilities, so that people part of that, or it's process change. All of those things, if we understand how people react to the change, that's going to make us a good leader. And I would like to think boomers are sensitive to that, being parents of the millennials. And one of the things Kurt and I talk a lot about is who gets along best among the generations. And of course, because we met years ago, Kurt and I immediately got together and formed a friendship. Maybe it was the wine that night, not sure. But we all say that, boomers and millennials are, two bugs in a rug. So again, soliciting the support and assistance of other generations to get the message across, I think that's a strength that the boomers have and will try to enact in any of their change management efforts.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny. My son at one point worked for Google, and they had gone through, even though I can't imagine that there's a ton of generational stuff going on in their workforce, but a lot of different kinds of characteristics. And they would very deliberately go through and understand kind of how people were categorized in terms of desire for risk, desire for aversion to conflict, how they communicate, how much they thought they had to communicate, all those kinds of things, and would flip it around and turn it to an advantage. And I can't remember what the whole categorization was, but my son said it. He said, "Yeah, you'd be in meetings at time, and somebody would say, that's a very orange thing to say, or that's because they had different colors that were categorized these different things." And it was interesting to me because it brought those differences out into to the surface in a humorous way that people could talk about.
Yeah. And you mentioned something, because of the whole Google environment is one in and of itself. I walked into that company one time and was shown to a conference room with 8 swings hanging down from the ceiling. No table, no chairs, but that's how we were going to. But one last thing just about the boomers. One of the things boomers tend to be regarded as very reliable, and you want a reliable leader. And I think boomers, just because we have the experience and we tend to be the older ones in the room, if we can leverage that to gain the trust and the belief by those we're trying to lead, I think that reliability factor is really key.
Yeah, and John, the last generation Z, before we forget, we don't forget about the youngest one coming into the workforce. They really, and this is very surprising, actually, the pandemic has brought some statistics to light that we would not probably have thought otherwise. So Laurie talked about them being the first truly born digital generation. So one would think that throughout the pandemic and then maybe post-pandemic, they would be very technology focused and want more technology. But what we're seeing is about 42% is the statistic that of Gen Zs that want to actually return to the office, because what we're seeing and what makes them a good leader, I think, and this is what I'm kind of leading on to, is they are going to be our balance between technology and people, because they're really longing that personal, that professional connection, and that happens for them best in person. Now, technology, of course, they're going to be our gurus in that regard, in their own way, towards automation, which is something I know you talk about a lot, John. Mm-hmm. So I think we're going to have a lot to learn from Z in terms of automation, but I think we're going to start to see that balance. So you're seeing millennials bridge, Z's balance. That's kind of two quick takeaways.
That's good. Yeah, very interesting. If anybody wants to declare what category they're in, what cohort they're in the chat, feel free to go and do that. And we may post it, we may not, but feel free to do that, as well as any comments or questions that you might have for either Laurie or Kurt. So let me talk a little bit at the flip side of the equation. So you've got all these different cohorts in an organization. What makes their eyes roll when a leader does, what are the big mistakes that a leader can make in the eyes of different cohorts? Sounds like Laurie, you sound like you know some of them, Laurie.
Well, I'm just remembering, when did it happen? It was in New Zealand in the legislature, when she just looked over at the guy and said, "Okay, boomer." And
that's right, yeah.
Like, it became a meme, and I was just thinking, that kind of know-it-all, do as I say, with just being unaware. I think that's a huge turnoff that the boomers can bring to the stage. I don't know, some of not so much the Zs. I just haven't seen, Zs haven't really come into their leadership roles yet, because they are so new to the workforce. But I think some of the other generations, assuming that technology is the answer, is a real turnoff to traditionals and boomers. But I think with the Zs, to Kurt's point, that's going to be a really interesting evolution. One of the things, just real quick, in the Chicago office of HBR, we bring in summer interns every year, and they're sharp, typically seniors in college, and typically we offer all of them, jobs as beginning consultants the next year, and most of them respond. Well, they've spent a summer together, and these are all Zs. And then they all come to work together. And one of the things I notice is they all go to lunch together, they socialize, they plan trivia nights, they're doing all sorts of things for engagement. And to Kurt's point, this is the group that has suffered the absolute most in they are miserable. The studies show that. I've talked to quite a few of the younger generation at HBR, just trying to connect with them and keep them connected. But I think that's kind of just when Kurt and I were refreshing our research, I really assumed that the Zs and even the millennials were going to be the ones that survived the easiest in COVID because of technology, because of their adoption of technology. And I was so very wrong.
That's very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. And to Laurie's point, of what I'm going to tag along here and bring up to a Harvard Business Review study that showed millennials are actually the most burned out generation post-pandemic. And it's because of that bridge role. We were bridging too much is what happened. We weren't given, whether it was time off, too many hours working to put together the requirements or implementation for the technology that was rolled out literally in 1 year, that some Microsoft professionals have said would have taken 10 years in the context of Microsoft 365. And then, as we mentioned earlier, the Zs really coming back and saying, hey, I want to return to the office. So I think I'm going to jump back to X, though, and say that the independence is a great positive in a leader, but too much independence actually, on the flip side, will create increased siloization. And that is, I think, what's hurting some organizations as Xers are ascending to those higher levels of leadership, as if they are just grabbing on to independence and thinking that's going to drive innovation. While I've witnessed it myself in my professional roles, that it actually sometimes creates further siloization between groups that need to be getting along better. And so that actually drives millennials up the wall, because we're trying to get everyone to work together, and then here someone's giving a lot more independence than what's probably necessary in those cases. So just balancing between X and Y, I see that to be honestly the greatest friction between all the generations, is actually between X and Y. Because as you mentioned, leadership, Laurie brought up the demographic, the youngest probably haven't got there yet. But now what you're going to see is this big stark difference between X and Y as they both vie for future leadership roles within organizations.
And a real life example of that, or a real life, just pointing to the negative impact that can have. Typically in consulting, you go up through the ranks, but it really is that manager level. You go from consultant to senior consultant to manager, senior manager. It's that manager level that is kind of the bedrock of our consulting engagements. They do a lot of the project management. They're becoming subject matter experts. Something that was a fallout, and I thought it was COVID, but it was so much more and there's always turnover in a consulting firm. Our turnover of those millennials was abnormally high. And many of them in the Chicago office I've gotten to know, so I would reach out and talk to them. And it's very much what Kurt is saying. They were left on their own. Their bosses, very much the Gen Xers, didn't understand that the millennials needed more interaction, not the touchy-feely group hug in the afternoon stuff, but just more collaboration in the workplace. And some of these millennials were just left on their own, and their bosses just assumed, oh, they're going to love that. They're going to like working. They're very productive. They became overly productive, and they burnt out. And I was sorry to see that it's not just within consulting and HBR that I've noticed that seems to be the generation that is looking for more and has started looking outside of their own companies. A lot of them are taking 4 to 6 weeks off just to kind of get their head straight again. So it's and this is a little bit of Monday morning quarterback, John, too. We didn't know a lot of this. We've learned so much, but we're not going back to the way we were. We're going to be in a hybrid work environment. So lessons to be learned for sure. Especially about retention.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about, we talk a lot about agile environments and agile project environments, and that you have to fail fast. And so talk a little bit about maybe in your take, which cohort has the biggest tolerance for failure and for that, and which has the least. I think I can guess, being in one of them, but talk a little bit about the nature of failure.
Kurt, you want to start?
Oh, okay, I can start. And these are ideas, John, based off of the research and the many times Laurie and I presented on this topic. So we may not get everything right. If there's some variation, that's fine. But I think failure from an X, I think, Laurie, you can disagree with me on this. I think Xers are the most vulnerable or the most able to fail and come back because of that creative, independent spirit that they have. I think that because of the process management framework that boomers and millennials actually share, millennials are more of the flat leadership, right? More of a flat type ideology, whereas boomers, a little bit more structure, but they still can get along with the flat, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So those two generations think about that. So when you think about failure seems to come from a place of, I failed as a leader. I did something that wasn't in line with the process we agreed to. And I think Xers are more free sometimes to think independently, and like we talked about what the negative impacts of that are, or when it can go too far. But I think that's why I think the answer to your question, for me at least, is X. Z, Laurie, what do you think? I mean, the Zs, I think it's the failure of automation. I think a Z coming into the workforce today, given what we see in the commercial technology world, I believe the greatest point of contention will be that their expectations are going to be so much higher than what is actually present in our corporate or professional organizations, because they are lagging behind what's in the commercial technology market.
Yeah,
So
I used to laugh about that, and I had a little shtick that I would do that for a lot of recent college graduates. Coming into corporate America is like going into a computer museum, and I think how COVID impacted that is going to be really interesting to watch downstream. I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Laurie.
No, that was what I was going to say was I
Yep.
think they're going to be disappointed, if you will, until their expectations are reset. And I think that's where leaders that are different generations can help them reset that expectation. I think that will help with employee or workforce retention if you can reset those expectations or set them appropriately and show them how they can contribute to what they eventually may want out of an organization, like, for instance, in terms of automation or whatnot. Task them on the things that they want, and I think you're going to be able to retain them longer.
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed with the Zs, the few that are in the workplace, is that they lack patience. And patience may be something that just grows with age and greater experience, but they lack patience, and there's a sense of immediacy. To Kurt's point, they're used to solving things through gamification or whatever. So, in some ways, I think that lack of patience may contribute to faster failures. I'm not sure faster failures are a bad thing. I mean, I'm of the generation that believed in SDLC, right? And now Agile comes around, and I'm like, what's that? We've got to have our nice 7-gate SDLC process laid out. So just a real difference between kind of the older and the younger generations in the workforce.
So in wrapping up a little bit, why don't you guys think a little bit about a couple of takeaways that you would like to give to aspiring oxymorons who are interested in trying to think about how they bridge generational perspectives? How do they act as an effective leader, regardless of where their starting point is, but how do they act as an effective leader bridging generations? Who wants to go first?
I can take it. I would say if you're hearing a theme today, I think this theme will continue, but being aware of technology overload. Doesn't matter which generation you are, being aware of that technology overload and how it then affects each generation, I think then gives you a better lens into how your own workforce, if people report to you, or that indirect reporting, as I talked about before, how it affects them, then you can better account for that. For instance, if you're working with an agile millennial team, giving them more, maybe half-day Fridays or some more time off to recover, because you're still going to be in this, the realistic part of this is that you're still going to be relying on the bridge generation to continue to function as is, but you may need to back off a little bit and give them some more time off. Younger generation than that, the Zs, you may need to accelerate if they're, of course, you're following, the public health guidelines and all of that. That's up to each corporation and individual to decide what's right for them, of course. But Z may want to accelerate return to work for them. And so I think those are just some quick takeaways from the younger two. But Laurie, what do you think about the other two, X and millennial?
Yeah, I think what's key for all the generations is how do they learn and absorb. So how do you communicate to them? What are those not only the words that come out of your mouth, but the method or the mode of delivery. So with younger generations, webinars, I mentioned gamification, anything that is interactive with technology is great. The older generations tend to appreciate more one-on-one communications, even phone calls, dare I say, with the traditionalists. Mm-hmm. But I think the way we communicate sometimes is almost as important as what we are communicated in order for it to fall on fertile ground. So just understanding communication styles of the different generations and what's going to stick. For example, earlier today, John, don't send me an email that fits more than a screen. I won't read it. So.
Well, listen, thank you guys very much. It's lived up to my expectations. I've seen you guys present a couple of times. I'll put contact information in the show notes if anybody's looking for really good keynotes and a really interesting conversational oriented panel that they could have for an event. Whether virtual or in person, you guys are really good, and you're also oxymorons in your own right, as well as knowing one when you see one. So thank you guys very much for your time, and thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks,
It's a
John.
pleasure, John.